Hi, good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about the first school of economic thought taught in terms of models and laws explaining the behavior of economics based on models was first discovered in the 17th and the 18th century, and it was done by a group of economists in France. So today I would like to talk about what was the need, why is that they felt the need to be able to discover a certain law or invent a certain law to explain the behavior of economics in their society, in the society of France in this case. So let me take you back to the 17th, 18th century France. During that time, at a certain period, a king called Louis XV was ruling France, and France was also going to a lot of wars, and France had to finance these wars. And on the top of that, there was also the requirements of the upper class of France uh, for, for their courts. The king had to have his court, and there were these noblemen who had to um, conduct expensive banquets and lived with great luxury, owning a lot of jewels. All these were financed from the treasury of the France, or the taxes that the king collected from the people. So during the time of Louis XV, uh, the treasury of France was running low. So they had to find ways to fill up the coffers of France, and a group of economists at that time proposed certain ways. Firstly, they had a model of the economy of France, and based on that model, they had given some suggestions to the King of France so as to be able to increase the wealth of France. So now let me talk about the model that these group of economists that I'll be shortly talking about had proposed. At that time, the economists had actually seen the society like this, and the leader of those group of economists was a doctor in the court of Louis XV. His name was Francois Quesnay, and he lived between 1694 to 1774. Based on what he understood of the economy, he had thought of the economy. Um, he had proposed a model about the economy, and the model goes like this. At that time, even before that, let me give you an idea of the society of France, even before talking about the model that Quesnay proposed. Let me talk about how the society of France was divided into. So, firstly, there were the upper class, which included the ruling class and other group of people who had high titles from the time of their birth, the noblemen or the aristocracy. The upper class also included a group of religious priests, and those group were called the group was called clergy. And after that, there were these merchants, factory owners, and the bankers. And below the bankers, and this is a hierarchy. And I'll talk about that hierarchy also, why it is so. But in below the group of the upper class were the merchants, bank owners, and factory owners. And after that, there were the peasants or the farmers of France. So I told you that Quesnay, the doctor in the court of Louis XV, had modeled the society of France and wanted to explain the behavior of the economy of France based on this model. So his model goes like this. So I told you there were these peasant farmers. So peasant farmers would grow the crops in the land, and they would also produce other items, the agricultural items like fishes, and they would also graze lands. They would also take their animals to graze lands, and also hunt animals. So there were many of these activities that these peasant farmers performed. And these peasant farmers, after having performed these activities, after having their uh, produced certain items based on these activities, let us for example say that crops, the peasant farmers would firstly keep a certain amount of their crop for themselves, and the rest they would sell it to the landowner. The rest they would sell it to the customers, or people in the society of France. And the money that they would get out of selling that extra produce, they would give it to the landowner, because they have taken the land on which they produced from the landowner they as rent. And so they would give this money as rent. The landowner would take the money, and he would spend it on, he's a rich person, and he would spend it on certain luxury items like silk buttons, or some candlesticks, at a particular kind of candlesticks, or any other luxury items that were in the market. And the money in the process would go to the craftsmen. And the craftsmen, because they were the one who produced the buttons, the silk buttons, and many other items. And with the money that the craftsmen received, they would give it to the farmers for and buy food. So in this way, Quesnay had proposed a certain economic model and talked about how money flows within different groups in a society. And, uh, and after explaining about this model, he found out that uh, he had explained that there will be more resources that will flow in the cycle between the different groups in the society if the farmer in the first place who had produced the crop had had grown a lot of surplus. And it is this surplus that was able to create an increase in the resources that were circulating in the economy between different groups in the society. So in effect, what Francois Quesnay, the doctor in the court of Louis XV, had told, was that the source of wealth in an economy lied in the surplus generated by the farmer. Without the surplus crop or the surplus produce, the resources, there wouldn't be a circulation of resources. With an increase in the surplus, there will be a circulation of the increase in the resources. And with the decrease in the surplus, the resources that are circulating between different groups in the society, as I mentioned, the landowners, the craftsmen, the farmers. By the way, this is a very simple model, but this was the first economic thought. So, uh, if the surplus reduced, the resource that would be circulating in the economy would also reduce. So the amount of resource that is circulating in the economy would determine the wealth of a nation. More the resource, more would be the wealth. Less the resource, less would be the wealth. More the surplus, more the resource, more the wealth. Le- if there's a reduction in the surplus, there'll be a reduction in the resources that will be moving in the cycle, and the economy shrinks. In the first case, the economy expands, and after that, the economy shrinks. In the later case. So this is the model that Quesnay had invented and had seen in the economy of France at that time. And he had also told that the economy of France had shrunk because the surplus generated by the peasant farmers had gone down. And that is what he had concluded from the economy of France at the time when Louis XV was ruling France. And the king also wanted to know what can be done to increase the resources in his treasury, or the money in his treasury, because France was, as I told you, was going through uh, was fighting a number of battles, and on the top of that, it also required money to finance the court of the king, and also the noble people, the aristocrats, who were living off the money. of the treasury, which in turn is collected as taxes from the people. So, since the king wanted solutions to increase the wealth of France, Quesnay had told that the wealth of France props from the surplus generated by the farmers. And the surplus, Quesnay had seen that it has come from all those items which are produced in close relation to nature. So there were this group of economists who had proposed that it was items that are produced from the nature that ultimately increase the wealth of a nation. There are flaws in that. That is not how people think about it right now. But since this was the first economic thought, I want to start with the first and evolve from here to the present understanding, probably in a later video. But this video is about the first economic thought. Since the king had asked the help of the economist, the Dr. Quesnay, he had told that it is the surplus that triggers the flow of resources, and increasing the surplus would increase the resource. Now the question is, what would the Dr. Quesnay have proposed to increase the surplus itself? For this, he had initially found out there are some problems with the way the king had treated his peasant class or the farmer class, and he wanted certain rectifications. And the rectifications are like this. Firstly, he had said that the income of the farmers was very low, and for this he gave the reasons. He gave two reasons. One reason was that the king was heavily taxing the farmers. And let me tell you, during that time, France was divided into a number of groups, as I told you. The highest group, the upper class, consisting of the ruling class and the people who assumed titles from birth, the noblemen or the aristocracy, the aristocracy did not have to pay any tax to the king. The entire tax burden was put on the farmer. And at that time, the agriculture of France was unproductive. So at a time when agriculture was unproductive, at a time when the farmers in the countryside of France were poor and were suffering, and the countryside was suffering from a number of famines, it was the aristocrats, it was the upper class who were being completely exempt from paying the taxes. So Quesnay had said that this extra taxes, high taxes on the farmers, were ensuring that the money left with the farmer for him to invest in the extra seeds to grow more crops and increase the surplus, which was the lifeblood of economy according to Quesnay. The money required to invest in tools for the next year, for example, would be less. The farmers would not have that money because of the high taxes he paid to the king. On the top of that, the king had also ensured that the farmers would have some restrictions while they sold their grains. For example, at that time this was a real restriction. While the farmers sold their corn grains, they were not allowed to sell it abroad, and also there were some restrictions while they sold it to their own people within their own nation. So again, this would reduce the income of the farmer, because if he is restricted from selling his crops that he had produced, where is he going to get that income? So these were the two problems that the Dr. Quesnay had found out in the economy of France. The main problem was the income that the farmer generated out of agriculture was very low. Quesnay told that entire wealth of the nation had had been triggered from the surplus generated by the farmer, and the income generated by the farmer is low, and therefore he is not able to increase the surplus that is triggering a flow of large number of resources in the society, which would ultimately expand the economy. And because the farmers' income were low, the economy of France was shrinking. This was the idea of the economist, the doctor Francois Quesnay. So he also had a solution as to what needs to be done, what the king should do to ensure that the economy of France expands. And from what I told you, you can imagine that the solution he would be giving is that to ensure the income generated by the farmer is increased. And for this, he had proposed that the king should completely exempt the farmer from taxation. But then, where would the king get his? How could the king fill up his treasury? He had told that the aristocrats had to be taxed. Formerly, they were completely exempt, but then there was a problem. King could not uh, tax the aristocrats because aristocrats had thought of it as a status symbol for them. It was it was something that cemented their status in the society. So there was a dilemma, but nevertheless, King Quesnay had proposed that the taxation be imposed on those people on the upper class who were not paying taxes, especially at a time when the peasant farmers were poor, when the peasant farmers were paying huge amounts of taxes. And this is the first solution, to impose high taxes on the otherwise tax exempted aristocrats. The next solution was, I told you there was another group, the group of merchants, the craftsmen, the factory owners. These people already had to pay taxes. There was no exemption for them like the aristocrats or the clergy. So, but they got certain privileges from the king, and the privileges were got to do with the prevailing economic thought at that time. An economic thought, there was slightly a kind of economic thought that was prevailing, other than what is being proposed right now by Quesnay. The prevailing economic thought was based on uh, the fact that it was gold, the amount of gold that a country possesses, that determines the wealth of a nation. Based on this thought process, it was ensured that the factory owners, the class of manufacturing, class that involved manufacturing, the merchants and the bankers, especially for the factory owners, it was ensured that the imports into the country was restricted by high taxation on those imports. What would happen then would be that um, an increased taxation of products that are coming from the foreign goods would increase the cost of the products of those foreign goods when they're sold in the country, France, and they would be less preferred. Those foreign goods would be less preferred by the people who are buying them, and it would be the goods produced by the factory owners in France which the people of France would prefer to buy. In other words, the competition between goods was reduced, and this ensured that the factory owners of France got a good price, not a low price, but a good price. And the people as a whole were losing out because they did not have an opportunity to buy from a cheaper, to buy the cheaper foreign goods if there were no import restrictions on them. So this way, the merchant class, the class of factory owners were getting rich. This because of the privileges they enjoyed. The first privilege was they had there were restrictions that the king imposed on the imports. The second privilege was they could export. They got rights to export in the foreign territory. They got rights to trade in the foreign territories. For example, in foreign colonies, this they had to get a permission, and they were free to trade outside in the foreign colonies, and this also made them rich. But there was one other thing that made the middle class or the merchant class or the factory owners class uh, rich. And let me just explain this to you based on what really happened in France in 1696. In 1696, there were these group association of merchant farmers, merchant manufacturers related to manufacturing silk buttons. So what happened in 1696 was the government authorities imposed a ban on the production of woolen buttons. So some enterprising tailor had um, had made or had manufactured a woolen button, and that was in demand in the market at that time. But the authorities of the king at that time ensured that the the woolen button would not be should not be manufactured or sold in France at that time. So what this had done is it had helped uh, those manufacturers who were producing silk buttons, because they would be rid of competition locally itself, and they would stay in business. They would not go out of business because of um, the sale of woolen buttons. So even when the ban was imposed on the production and the sale of woolen buttons, there were some shopkeepers in France who were still selling these woolen buttons. And having seen this, some members of the merchant guild or the guild related to the business of silk buttons would go to the shops of the tailors and take away the woolen buttons to ensure that uh, these woolen buttons are not sold. Also, at that time, anyone who wore dresses having woolen buttons could be arrested. They were threatened that they would be arrested. So that was the power and the privilege that was given to the manufacturing class at that time by the king, of course. Also, so despite paying taxes to the king, the manufacturing class grew rich because they had certain privileges. I told you what those privileges are. It has got to do with restriction of imports. It has got to do with uh, permission to do trade in the colonies outside of France, and it has got to do with bans on certain kind of products that others produce and which would favor a certain guild. So now, so Quesnay, the doctor, had proposed that these privileges that the merchant class or the factory owners class had enjoyed should be taken away. The king should ensure that these privileges are removed. Now you might be thinking, what they are also paying taxes, the factory class. Why would one want a removal of their privileges? Because because Quesnay thought that um, these were group of people who did not generate any surplus. That was the prevailing thought. Just like farmers had produced crops and kept a portion of it for themselves, and the surplus was sold. The group of economists who thought like Quesnay, they were called physiocrats, because physiocracy means a rule by nature, and therefore they were called physiocrats. So these group of economists had thought that uh, there were these groups of merchants and there were these groups of factories, and the factory owners. Uh, the factory owners they thought that the factory owners were not producing the surplus just like the farmers were producing. They only thought that the surplus had already been produced in the farms. For example, let us take the example of uh, a factory owner who produced silk buttons. The silk that was required for making the silk buttons um, would be used by the factory owner to produce silk buttons. The silk was already there. It was already a surplus that is generated from the manufacturing class. So therefore, the group of economists who thought like Quesnay, called the physiocrats, had thought that The surplus was not generated by the manufacturing class. They were only changing one form of the surplus to another form which was already produced by the agricultural class. And Quesnay had also told that the merchants were getting rich only because they had the privileges like the import restrictions given by the king, ability to trade outside in certain colonies, and also the ban on certain kind of products within the country itself that favored the merchants. It was only because of this that these merchants were getting rich, not because they had really produced a surplus. Well, that is not true in the present day, but at that time the economics once again had thought that the value could not be generated out of producing manufacturing goods. Nowadays, it is the manufacture of goods and production of services that generate a lot of value for the economy. But then that was the prevailing thought at that time. Uh, so so let me continue with what Quesnay had told. Quesnay had initially told that the farmers' income had to be risen so as to increase the surplus crops that they produced, or surplus or agricultural produce that they made, and this surplus would drive an increase in the would cause an increase in the circulation of resources within an economy, and then the economy expands. And he had suggested solutions, and I talked to you about those solutions. And these solutions were also implemented. But even before that, he had also told that once the surplus increases after the farmer's income goes up and invests in increasing his agricultural produce, and once the economy expands, it would be the fruits of the expansion would be enjoyed by the aristocracy, even though he had suggested that they should pay taxes. Despite paying taxes, they would enjoy the fruits of the surplus. Not only the aristocracy, the merchants would also, the factory owners and the merchants would also enjoy the fruits of the expansion of the economy. So finally, in the 1760s, the ideas of physiocrats were implemented, and it was ensured that the farmers could sell their corn wherever they could. I mean, there were no restrictions on selling corn. The farmers could sell corn within the country without much of restriction. So restrictions were removed. But after that, the ideas related to the physiocrats had gone into a decline. So, and now let me tell you that this was the first school of economic thought, that is physiocracy, and it had its flaws, but let me tell you what it meant at that time. At that time, before the physiocrats had invented their model, the prevailing thought was any country that accumulated a lot of gold was a rich country. Uh, but uh, but that also meant that the countries that were trying to get rich by accumulated gold were were restricting the imports into the country so that gold does not flow to the country. That itself was a kind of a flawed economic principle, because restriction of imports is not good for all sections of the society. Restriction of the imports uh, would ensure that the merchants who are selling their goods within the country could are, are benefited, because they wouldn't have to have any competition with the foreign goods. They would also charge high prices to their customers, and and eventually the customers would have to pay high, and the merchants uh, would increase their wealth because of that. So it would only benefit one class of the society, the merchants. It won't benefit all classes of the society, and hence imports were needed. The basic premise that the imports was should be restricted, the prevailing thought that was going before the invention of physiocrat should be restricted, was a flawed principle. So the physiocrats were the first ones to see that um, there was value in encouraging those people who are closely associated with nature, those people who had produced agricultural products, because it is from that sector where the surplus had come from, and it is the surplus that was driving the economy. Without this surplus, the resources in the economy, the flow of the resources in the economy would not increase. So, and at that time, there was one more point. The and they could be encouraged. The people who are associated with nature could be encouraged by the king by ensuring that they generate a high income. And one way to do that was to reduce the taxes or to completely do away with the taxes. Imposing taxes on aristocracy does not reduce the surplus. Imposing, taking away privileges from the factory class or the manufacturing class does not increase the surplus, but increasing the taking away or doing away with taxation and reducing restrictions on the sale of agricultural produce would increase the surplus, which was the lifeblood of the economy. So, but at the same time, the physiocrats had been quite revolutionary in finding value in agricultural produce, which was not thought, and this was not the line of thought before that. Value was seen in accumulation of gold, and it had its own problems, I told you. But at the same time, the physiocrats did not see that there was more value in manufacturing goods that could increase the resource circulation in an economy. Later on, when Adam Smith proposes his theory, he says that the the net production in the economy, that is the production of goods, manufactured goods as well as agricultural goods, is the one that is responsible uh, for increasing the wealth of a nation. But despite that, despite this flaw, since they were the first economists or to propose that a certain model, certain laws in economics, and it is from this base point that the rest of the economics starts to evolve from the time of 17th to 18th century. And because of the eminence of the importance or the of this base, I had to talk about the first school of economists, about the physiocrats. So, so that's what I had to say today. Thank you very much.